The first reports did not describe a protest. They described an officer down. Shortly after 10 p.m. on July 4, 2025, emergency dispatchers in Johnson County, Texas, began receiving urgent radio traffic from officers responding to the Prairieland ICE Detention Center in Alvarado. People dressed mostly in black had gathered outside the facility. Fireworks were being launched toward the property, creating loud explosions and flashes that echoed across the detention center. Then came the report that changed everything. An Alvarado police officer had been struck by gunfire. The shooter disappeared into the darkness as officers rushed to secure the scene. Witnesses scattered, vehicles began leaving the area, and no one could immediately determine how many people had been involved. Within minutes, what initially appeared to be another Independence Day protest had become the focus of a major federal criminal investigation. Investigators immediately faced one central question. Had the violence erupted spontaneously during a demonstration, or had someone planned a confrontation before anyone arrived? That question would shape every stage of the investigation. In the hours that followed, officers secured the area while investigators began documenting shell casings, fireworks debris, damaged property, abandoned equipment, and surveillance footage. At the same time, detectives started identifying everyone who had been present outside the detention center. Early witness accounts offered only fragments of what had happened. Some described confusion after the fireworks began. Others believed parts of the night's events appeared coordinated. Physical evidence, digital records, and later forensic analysis would become essential in determining which account most accurately reflected what occurred. Months later, prosecutors would argue that encrypted communications, travel records, and other evidence showed preparation before the demonstration began. Defense attorneys disagreed, maintaining that many participants believed they were attending a political protest and that lawful travel, encrypted messaging, or protest equipment did not by themselves establish a criminal conspiracy. Those competing interpretations would ultimately be tested in federal court. But on the night of July 4th, investigators had only one certainty. A responding police officer had been shot. Everything else still had to be reconstructed. Across North Texas, Independence Day celebrations were winding down. Families watched fireworks, neighborhoods held cookouts, and local law enforcement handled the usual holiday calls. About 30 miles south of Fort Worth, however, another gathering was taking shape outside the Prairieland ICE Detention Center. For years, the facility had been the site of demonstrations over federal immigration policy. Community organizations, immigration advocates, attorneys, clergy, and activists regularly assembled outside its gates to protest immigration detention. While some demonstrations became loud or confrontational, most ended without serious violence. That history influenced the initial response. When officers first received reports of demonstrators outside the detention center, there was little reason to expect gunfire would follow. Only later would investigators examine whether those early assumptions affected how quickly the danger was recognized. The detention center itself had long represented a larger national debate. Operated under contract with U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement, Prairieland housed individuals awaiting immigration proceedings or removal from the United States. To supporters, facilities like Prairieland were an essential part of enforcing federal immigration law. To critics, they symbolized policies they believed relied too heavily on detention and separated families. By the summer of 2025, immigration enforcement had become an increasingly divisive issue across the country. Demonstrations outside detention centers had become more frequent, particularly in Texas. Against that backdrop, a July 4th protest outside Prairieland did not initially appear unusual. What happened there did. As investigators reconstructed the timeline, they discovered that participants had traveled from different parts of Texas to attend the gathering. Court records later showed that investigators examined vehicle movements, hotel records, surveillance footage, mobile phone data, and communications recovered through search warrants. Rather than relying on any single source, investigators compared multiple forms of evidence to establish who had arrived, when they arrived, and how they moved before and after the shooting. That chronology became critical. A message sent before the confrontation might suggest planning. The same message sent afterward could simply describe events that had already occurred. Likewise, witness testimony often reflected different perspectives. Some people remembered confusion. Others recalled organization. Instead of treating any single account as definitive, investigators compared witness statements against physical evidence and digital records to identify points where independent sources aligned. By the morning of July 5, local investigators had been joined by federal agencies, including the FBI. The case had expanded far beyond a local shooting investigation. Outside the detention center, crime scene technicians documented shell casings, fireworks debris, damaged fencing, and other physical evidence before anything could be disturbed. Ballistics experts examined recovered cartridge cases and projectiles to determine how many shots had been fired, where they originated, and whether multiple firearms had been used. At the same time, investigators gathered surveillance footage from the detention center, nearby businesses, traffic cameras, and private property surrounding the area. No single recording captured the entire incident. Instead, investigators synchronized numerous camera angles to reconstruct the movements of people and vehicles throughout the evening. Digital evidence soon became just as important. Investigators analyzed mobile phones, location records, photographs, videos, and communications recovered through court-authorized searches. Each source revealed only part of the story. Together, they allowed investigators to build a detailed timeline of the hours before, during, and after the shooting. As public attention intensified, the case quickly became part of a broader national discussion about immigration policy, political protest, and violence against law enforcement. Yet investigators remained focused on a much narrower question. Who fired the shot, and what had led to that moment? Answering those questions would require looking well beyond the crime scene. The investigation would eventually stretch across multiple states, generate thousands of pages of evidence, and culminate in one of the most closely watched federal prosecutions arising from political violence in recent years. But before prosecutors could argue intent, or defense attorneys could challenge it, investigators first had to understand how the events of July 4th unfolded. That process began by reconstructing the protest itself. As darkness settled over North Texas, demonstrators began arriving outside the Prairieland ICE Detention Center. Public records and evidence later presented in court indicate that participants traveled from several locations across Texas. Some arrived together, while others came separately. By late evening, a crowd had gathered outside the facility. Many wore dark clothing. Some carried banners and signs criticizing federal immigration policy. Others brought fireworks, which witnesses later described being launched near the detention center's perimeter. Initially, the gathering resembled previous demonstrations held at the facility. People chanted slogans, recorded the event on their phones, and assembled near the entrance while detention center staff monitored the activity from inside. According to testimony later presented during trial, the demonstration was intended, at least publicly, to protest immigration detention and draw attention to people being held inside the facility. For a time, the situation remained tense but controlled. Then the atmosphere began to change. The growing use of fireworks altered the atmosphere outside the detention center. Witnesses described repeated explosions near the perimeter, while surveillance footage later introduced in court captured flashes of light consistent with fireworks being launched throughout the area. Investigators recovered spent tubes and debris across the scene. Prosecutors would later argue that the fireworks created confusion, distracted responding officers, and contributed to the rapidly changing conditions outside the facility. Defense attorneys disputed that conclusion, arguing that fireworks, while controversial, had appeared at previous demonstrations and did not by themselves establish an intent to commit violent crimes. Whatever their purpose, the situation became increasingly chaotic. The noise made communication more difficult. Visibility shifted with every burst of light. As reports of the disturbance reached local authorities, officers were dispatched to assess the situation and protect both the facility and the people gathered outside. Initially, responding officers believed they were dealing with a protest that had become disorderly. Previous demonstrations at Prairieland had required police presence but had generally ended without serious injury. That history shaped the early response. As additional officers arrived, demonstrators moved around different areas outside the detention center. Investigators would later spend months reconstructing those movements using surveillance footage, witness statements, digital location data, and time-stamped communications. Small differences in timing proved critical. Then, the confrontation escalated. At some point during the disturbance, property surrounding the detention center sustained damage. Investigators documented damaged fencing and other signs of disruption while collecting physical evidence from across the scene. Moments later, gunfire erupted. According to evidence presented by prosecutors, an Alvarado police officer responding to the disturbance was struck by a bullet during the confrontation. The shooting transformed the situation instantly. What had begun as a demonstration now became the scene of an attempted murder investigation. Witnesses reacted differently in the immediate aftermath. Some fled the area. Others sought cover. Officers shifted their focus from crowd management to locating the source of the gunfire, protecting those nearby, and securing medical aid for the wounded officer. Emergency personnel quickly transported the officer for treatment. He survived. That fact would later influence the legal proceedings, as prosecutors emphasized both the seriousness of the attack and the extensive response it triggered. Meanwhile, investigators faced a far more immediate problem. The shooter had disappeared into the confusion. With numerous people present outside the detention center, investigators had to determine who remained at the scene, who left immediately after the shooting, and whether anyone had witnessed the gunfire itself. Those questions would shape the investigation for months. Ballistics testing would later help investigators estimate where shots had been fired and whether more than one firearm had been involved. At the same time, detectives began identifying witnesses. They interviewed responding officers, detention center employees, nearby residents, and individuals who had participated in the demonstration. Not every account matched. That was expected. People witnessing the same event from different locations often remember different details, particularly during fast-moving, stressful situations. Rather than relying on any single statement, investigators compared witness accounts against surveillance footage, physical evidence, and digital records. The goal was not to find identical stories. It was to identify where independent evidence pointed to the same sequence of events. As midnight passed, it became clear the investigation would extend well beyond Johnson County. Because the shooting occurred outside a federal immigration detention facility, federal authorities quickly joined local investigators. Within hours, the FBI and other agencies were assisting with the case. The investigation had become national in scope. Attention soon shifted beyond the crime scene itself. Investigators believed understanding what happened on July 4th would require examining what occurred before anyone arrived outside the detention center. Search warrants authorized the collection of evidence from electronic devices, vehicles, residences, and other locations connected to individuals believed to have attended the demonstration. Analysts examined surveillance recordings, license plate reader data, hotel records, mobile phone evidence, and publicly available photographs and videos posted online. One area received particular attention: encrypted communications. According to court records, investigators recovered conversations from the messaging application Signal through lawfully obtained electronic devices. Prosecutors later argued that some of those communications reflected planning before the demonstration and helped explain the sequence of events that followed. Defense attorneys rejected that interpretation. They argued that encrypted messaging applications are widely used for legitimate privacy reasons and that individual conversations could not be viewed in isolation from their broader context. Those competing interpretations would become a recurring theme throughout the case. Investigators also analyzed location data associated with mobile devices. Combined with surveillance footage and travel records, the information helped reconstruct when individuals arrived, where they moved during the demonstration, and how they left after the shooting. No single source answered every question. Instead, investigators assembled what prosecutors later described as a timeline built from many independent pieces of evidence. As that timeline developed, attention increasingly turned toward individual participants. Being present at a protest was not, by itself, a crime. Investigators therefore worked to distinguish between attendance and alleged criminal conduct. For each identified participant, they asked the same questions. When did they arrive? Who had they communicated with beforehand? Where were they positioned during the confrontation? What actions, if any, connected them to specific criminal allegations? Those questions guided the investigation as agents compared digital evidence, surveillance footage, witness testimony, and forensic findings. Over the following weeks, the volume of evidence grew rapidly. Laboratories analyzed ballistic evidence recovered from the scene. Digital forensic specialists examined lawfully seized electronic devices. Analysts reviewed thousands of photographs, videos, and investigative reports while investigators continued interviewing witnesses as new information emerged. Rather than viewing the detention center as the beginning of the case, investigators increasingly viewed it as the endpoint of a chain of events that may have started days, or even weeks, earlier. Federal prosecutors would later argue that the evidence revealed preparation before July 4th. Defense attorneys maintained that prosecutors were interpreting otherwise lawful conduct through the lens of what happened after the shooting. Ultimately, those competing narratives would be decided in court. Before that could happen, investigators had to determine exactly who had participated in the events outside Prairieland and what role, if any, each person had played. Months of investigation would eventually lead to arrests, federal indictments, extensive pretrial litigation, and a closely watched prosecution. The evidence gathered from the crime scene, digital records, surveillance footage, and witness interviews formed the foundation of that case. Whether it proved criminal intent beyond a reasonable doubt would become the central issue before a federal jury. The events outside the Prairieland ICE Detention Center unfolded in only a matter of minutes. Understanding them required months of investigation. And as prosecutors and defense attorneys prepared for trial, the focus shifted from reconstructing the shooting itself to examining the evidence against each individual defendant, evidence that would be challenged, tested, and debated in federal court before a jury tasked with deciding what truly happened on that 4th of July night.